you ever wondered why we don't hear more about the contributions of Black people in history? It's not because they didn't make any significant contributions. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Let me give you examples of history events that have been twisted or even erased from textbooks and the awful consequences of this action. Black history is a part of American history. Nevertheless, in schools, Black History Month and Martin Luther King Jr. Day end up being the only things acknowledged. There's no shortage of well-known white historical personalities, but aside from Black people like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, how many other Black historical figures can you think of? The truth is this. Black history is not taught in schools since it's not even covered in the national curriculum. For instance, only 4 Black historical figures are listed for every 39 white historical figures in Pennsylvania's academic standards for history, and only 5 Black historical figures are mentioned for every 18 white historical figures in America. The academic standards for history in Pennsylvania doesn't even mention the civil rights movement as a teaching standard. If you think that Black history is not worth teaching, this may change your mind. Let me share some examples of historic events that have been modified or erased. For example, even when the Black Panther Party is included in some textbooks or educational programs, it's sometimes vilified for its extremism. But the Panthers' food projects in Oakland, however, caught the attention of the US. In 1969, hundreds of school children began receiving free lunches from party members. Soon after, the initiative was embraced by party chapters throughout the country, and at its height, thousands of kids were fed through 45 separate programs. Under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI launched raids to dismantle the scheme, intimidating party members in front of school children. The result was that political leaders were pressured to provide a substitute because thousands of kids had grown accustomed to receiving free food. The USDA launched the school breakfast program in 1975 following the forcible termination of the Panthers program, and it continues to support the feeding of nearly 15 million kids to this day. Now, I bet you had no idea that all started with the Black Panthers back in the day. Because, media painted them as violent extremists. Yeah, go and tell that to all the kids who have been fed ever since the 60s when the program started. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the post-emancipation era. Due to attempts by lawmakers to rewrite history, the history of slavery and emancipation is notably clouded with partial truths and errors. In the period following 1865, often referred to as the Radical Reconstruction era, Black Americans experienced substantial progress on both social and political fronts. The first Black universities were established, the first Black representatives were chosen to serve in federal legislatures, and a large number of Black-owned enterprises were given the chance to prosper. Now, much of this progress was thwarted by the Jim Crow laws that were implemented enforcing racial segregation. But the prosperity of the Black people during this time is underreported, which doesn't show a fair picture at all. Well, the 2 examples I just mentioned are just a tip of a very big iceberg. What I'm about to tell you now is shocking. We all know about the Holocaust and what atrocities and gut-wrenching acts the Nazis did to the Jewish people, but one thing that's often downplayed or left out of the textbooks is that Black people were a target for the Nazis as well. Because of the Nazis' perception of Black people as racially inferior, they harassed and tortured them. Many Blacks were imprisoned, forcefully sterilized, and brutally murdered. Interracial marriages were forbidden, and their children were banned from schools. The Nazis also regarded the Roma and Sinti as gypsy nuisance, a racially inferior group with criminal tendencies, but that wasn't all, since Germans with physical and mental disabilities were also killed. They were also seen as a burden on German society and the state. The ugly truth is that all of these atrocities have all been downplayed and whitewashed today. Just to be clear, slavery is mentioned in history books, but it's not about the word slavery being mentioned. It's how slavery and abuse were downplayed. Now, you're going to be asking me, how exactly? So for a long time, textbooks have been a battlefield where the humanity and dignity of black people has been challenged. Politics have always been the primary concern of pedagogy, and they're evident throughout omissions, flagrant mistakes, and dubious interpretations, especially when it comes to racial matters. This is much more true with modern textbooks too. Stories have focused more on the kindness of enslavers than the cruelty they inflicted on their victims, even 150 years after freedom. There's even an accelerated Christian education high school textbook that referred to slavery as black immigration, with a note saying, "Not all immigrants have come to America willingly." How twisted is that? So very little has been written about black history, but the things that were written supported the viewpoint of white Americans and European colonists. Just ask yourself why we're not talking about Malcolm X and Black History Month. Why is it always Martin Luther King Jr. talking about peaceful protesting, which, guess what, newsflash, hasn't resolved a single thing. But no, we never talk about that because King's teachings played into the white man's hand. And that's not even everything. Our medical textbooks are even worse. Rhiannon Parker, an Australian researcher at the University of Wollongong, was looking for pictures of bodies that readers may recognize as male or female. But she found out the bodies were predominantly white, slender, and youthful, compared to 75% of male bodies. 86% of the photos of women she found were white. Not only does this smell like racism, it also puts black people in danger too. Because images of skin conditions are only shown on white people, it's more difficult for doctors to diagnose these conditions for black people's skin. This is just one example of how black people got worse medical treatment. Another example has to do with the way white doctors perceive black people. In the context of pain treatment, black individuals receive less attention and care compared to white people. The evidence shows that medical students and residents have incorrect views about biological distinctions between blacks and whites, and that these beliefs are predictive of racial prejudice and pain perception and the accuracy of treatment recommendations. It also gives clear proof that racial prejudice and pain perception is related to racial bias and recommendations for pain management. Long story short, black people are kept in more pain because they can probably take it because they're black. Imagine a young man complains to the doctor of excruciating back pain. He hopes that the doctor is going to evaluate his pain and recommend the best course of action to lessen his suffering. After all, alleviating pain and suffering is one of the main objectives of healthcare, but he doesn't get the level of care he should get because of his race or ethnicity. This also happens a lot with black women in childbirth, and we talked about this before. Studies show that they're about 3 times more likely to get complications or die during childbirth compared to white women. According to earlier studies, if someone's black, his pain will probably be underappreciated and undertreated. That's kinda hard to take in, hence the world tries to make racism a thing of the past while it's still alive today. But why do people think racism is something of the past? A particular social media post argues that although photographers took pictures during the civil rights movement in color, they intentionally chose to show them in black and white in order to make the images appear older. They did it so that they could make it look like all of this was old stuff and like the civil rights movement was just a struggle that didn't happen recently. Y'all, there are people alive today that marched in the civil rights movement. And you can't tell me that we got pictures of white celebrities and superstars from the 40s and 50s, but we can't get color pictures of people in the civil rights movement? Come on. Recent years have seen the appearance of color pictures of the civil rights struggle, but photographers and scholars agree that they're uncommon. According to David Haberstich, a curator of photography at the National Museum of American History, there are not many color photos from the time period generally because of financial limitations. Black and white film was substantially cheaper in the 1960s than color film. The cost of printing color photos was more than the cost of color film alone. But was this really the reason they printed in black and white? I guess we're never gonna know. So, you think black history is misrepresented? Which events did they not teach you about in school? Don't be afraid to let me know in the comments below, and please don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel and help me get the word out there. More people need to be informed. And as always, brothers and sisters and everything in between, thank you very much for choosing to spend your time with us today. We'll see you in our next video.